One of the things that's come up recently is that Gordon Brown isn't going to introduce a fiscal stimulus, which means he is going to actually put a lot more money into the economy. Now, Gordon Brown, of course, doesn't have any money of his own. He can only get it by either taxing the populace, the UK population, or he has to borrow it. If he borrows it, it is essentially deferred taxation because it has to be repaid by future generations on this. Now, this is very interesting because the price that has to be paid by Gordon Brown in the market to borrow this money is set by the market, not by Gordon Brown, because they will simply not lend it to him if he's regarded as uncreditworthy. So Gordon Brown is not the finest credit in the market right now. That is the German bank. The Bundesbank is the finest credit in the European market. That means they can raise funds at a cheaper rate of interest. Or if you want to put it in terms of a mortgage, they will be able to get a mortgage at, shall we say, 4%, but Gordon Brown will have to pay up to 4.5 or 4.8% for his mortgage. Now, this becomes even worse, actually, if you look at other countries in Europe. And for instance, the Italians would have to pay over 5% for the money, about 5.4%, and the Greeks would have to pay up even more. Now, the Greeks are currently undergoing a number of riots and are in great problems with their government, and this sort of thing does impose a huge strain on governments, because these are not small sums of money that we're talking about. As anybody who has a mortgage will tell you, the difference between having your mortgage at 4% and having your mortgage at 5.5% is huge in terms of the monthly repayments you have to make, and this applies to governments just as well as it applies to sovereign countries. And this is why what is called the spread, which is the difference between the interest rate that you pay and the interest rate that the Germans pay in Europe on the Bunds, is so important, because this in fact translates into how much extra money you are going to have to repay for your borrowing. And Gordon Brown is currently faced with a situation, as the German Chancellor Merkel has pointed out to him, that he is not trusted in Europe, and he is therefore going to have to pay up on our behalf a large sum of money in interest payments, and that is going to have to be repaid not by Gordon Brown, but by your children and my children and our grandchildren. It is of some interest as to why the government is trying to pump all this money into the economy. And the way the government chose to do it was to actually reduce the VAT rate from 17.5% to 15%. Now, this is obviously going to have only a very slight effect. What would have been better, in fact, would be if the government had decided to remove VAT from fuel. This would have had an immediate effect and would have benefited the poorest members of the community, both those who are in work and those who are retired, because then you would be taking essentially 17.5% off the price of their fuel bill. Unfortunately, the government couldn't do this because of EU regulations, which said that VAT must be levied at a minimum rate of 15%. And this imposes a huge restriction on the way the government in this country can respond to economic circumstances, because there will be times when we do not wish to have VAT imposed uniformly at 15%, and that is something that we are constrained into by the EU. Now, as I said, basically Gordon Brown does not have any money of his own. He has to raise it in the market. And even with the best will in the world, people are going to call a halt on the amount of money they will lend to Gordon Brown at some stage. This means that the government is running out of money. It will run out of money whether it is in 6 months' time or 2 years' time. Irrespective of whether it is a Conservative government or a Labour government, it will at some stage run out, because quite simply their outgoings exceed their incomings in taxation. And particularly in a recession, when tax takes drop hugely, you'd simply have to cut your coat according to the cloth. Something has to give. And that means that we are going to have to face up. We cannot afford the sort of social security budget that currently we are running. We cannot afford actually to have immigrants coming into this country who are immediately eligible for social security the day they set foot in this country. There has to be a change in that area, which requires people to establish a period of worthwhile residence in this country before they can be eligible for social security, for social housing, for free health, and so on. We simply have to reduce the costs of government in this country, and that is what neither party is prepared to face up to and own up to and put straightforwardly to the British electorate. Costs have got to come down, and that means that we have to reduce the size of government spending by probably something like 5% to get ourselves back on track. Otherwise, our future generations, our children and grandchildren, will not thank us, because they will be lumbered with huge amounts of debt to repay, and it will eventually manifest itself in civil unrest, as it has in Greece.